What happens when a son throws his mother into the slums and mocks her faith? Lola Esmeralda lost her home and her husband's watch, but a silent stranger in a white shirt was waiting in the shadows. What happened next changed her roof and their souls forever. Lola Esmeralda stood by the fresh dirt of her husband's grave, clutching a worn-out wooden rosary. After 38 years of marriage, her husband, Delfin, was gone. Within 48 hours, her only son, Paulo, and his wife, Gina, were in her small living room in Quezon City. They spoke of heavy debts and investment opportunities in Canada. They pressured the grieving widow until she signed the deed to their family home. They promised her a small condo, but instead, they drove her to a cramped, rusty jeepney terminal. They handed her 5,000 pesos and Delfin's old Seiko watch. They told her they would call when they settled. They never did. Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal from those you loved most? Lola Esmeralda ended up in a toothless corner of Tondo. She rented a shack made of rotting plywood and rusted iron sheets for 1,200 pesos a month. The roof was a constellation of holes. When the monsoon rains hit, she did not pray. She just placed plastic buckets everywhere. She survived on repackaged instant noodles and collected rainwater to wash her face. She felt invisible, a ghost in a city of millions. She wondered if the God she served for decades had finally moved to a different neighborhood. Is it possible to find hope when even the sky seems to be falling on you? One afternoon, while Esmeralda was trying to sell some Sampaguita garlands near a local chapel, a wealthy neighbor named Mrs. Santos passed by. Instead of buying, she tossed a piece of stale pan de sal at Esmeralda's feet. "Your God won't fix that roof of yours, old woman. Move out before the wind blows you away," she sneered. Esmeralda felt the sting of hot tears, but as she looked up, she saw a man standing near a flickering street lamp. He wore a simple, clean white shirt and worn sandals. He did not offer money or pity. He just looked at her with eyes that seemed to see her entire soul. For the first time in months, Esmeralda felt her heart stop racing. If you believe that light can shine even in the darkest alley, please support this story with a like and subscribe to our channel. The wind began to howl, signaling a coming storm. The man in the white shirt stepped closer to the old woman. He picked up the bread from the dusty ground and handed it back to her with a gentle smile. "Peace be with you, Nanay," he said softly. His voice carried a strange authority that silenced the mockery of the crowd. Mrs. Santos felt a sudden, inexplicable chill and hurried away without another word. Esmeralda looked at the man, but he was already walking toward the shadows of the market. Who was this stranger who looked at her not as a beggar, but as a queen? The monsoon season arrived with a vengeance, turning the narrow alleys of Tondo into rivers of mud and trash. By late July, the floods reached Esmeralda's knees inside her own home. The cold water seeped into her bones, bringing a burning fever that made her vision blur. She collapsed on her wooden cot, clutching the empty Seiko watchbox, as if it could bring Delfin back to save her. She had no load on her prepaid phone to call for help. She had no strength left to boil water or even stand. The darkness of the shack felt like a heavy blanket. She accepted that she would die alone, just another forgotten statistic in the slums. Then, the creaky plywood door opened with a soft groan. It was the man in the simple white barong. He did not look like a rescuer, but he moved with a quiet, steady grace. He did not say much as he waded through the murky water. He placed a cool, damp cloth on her forehead and helped her sip a bitter herbal tea that smelled of ginger and healing. He stayed by her side through the long, humid night. "You are not forgotten, Nanay," he whispered. His voice did not sound like a stranger's. It sounded like the home she had lost. Every few hours, he would adjust her pillow or offer a prayer that felt like a physical shield against the cold. The man, who called himself Gabriel, began showing up every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. He did not just bring bags of rice and dried fish. He brought a heavy toolbox and rolls of thick wire. While the rest of the neighborhood hid from the rain, Gabriel climbed onto the roof. Esmeralda watched from her bed as he worked, his hands steady and strong. He replaced the rusted, hole-ridden sheets with brand-new galvanized iron that shone even under the gray sky. He fixed the dangerous, exposed wiring that had sparked every time it rained. He even found time to paint the interior walls a soft cream color, covering the mold of years. Esmeralda's deep bitterness began to melt like salt in the rain. One afternoon, She sat up and asked him why he was doing all this for a woman who had nothing to give in return. Gabriel stopped his work and looked at her with a smile that carried the warmth of the sun. "When someone falls, Nane, you don't ask why they fell," he said. "You just reach out your hand." He spoke of a father who counts every tear and sees every hole in a roof. His presence was a silent rebuke to the cruelty of her son and the mockery of her neighbors. The truth was beginning to surface in that small shack, a truth more powerful than any legal deed. If you believe that God sends helpers when we are at our lowest point, please support this message by liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Gabriel continued to work, his face weathered by the Philippine sun, proving that the greatest miracles are often found in the calloused hands of a friend who stays when everyone else has walked away. He was not just fixing a house, he was rebuilding a soul that the world had tried to crush. The heavy rains of the Habagat season finally paused, leaving behind a humid, heavy stillness in the air of Tondo. Gabriel had been coming for exactly 14 days, and the small shack no longer looked like a forgotten box of junk. The roof was secure, and the walls stood firm against the dampness of the earth. But one evening, as the church bells rang for the Angelus, Gabriel did not show up at his usual time. Esmeralda waited by her small window, her eyes scanning the crowded alleyway for the white barong that had become her only sign of hope. Panic began to tighten in her chest, a cold feeling that whispered she had been abandoned once again. She grabbed her cane and stepped out into the muddy street, her heart pounding against her ribs. She searched the nearby alleys, calling his name until her voice was a raspy whisper. Near a dark drainage canal, she finally found him. Gabriel was slumped against a graffiti-covered wall, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood was soaking through the sleeve of his white shirt from a deep, jagged wound on his arm. He looked pale, his strength seemingly drained by the very labor he had given to her. The people passing by ignored him, assuming he was just another injured man in a city that had no time for the broken. Esmeralda knelt in the mud, her hands trembling as she touched his cold skin. He looked at her with the same peaceful eyes, but they were heavy with pain. To get him to the small private clinic 3 blocks away, Esmeralda knew she needed money that she did not have. The clinic required a deposit of 3,000 pesos just to see a doctor after hours. She looked at her wrist, where Delphin's old Seiko watch sat, the last physical piece of her husband she had left in this world. It was her only inheritance, her only memory of 38 years of love. Without a second thought, she hurried to the nearest pawn shop, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. She watched the pawn shop clerk inspect the scratched metal and worn leather strap. 3,000, the man said coldly. Esmeralda nodded, tears streaming down her face as she pushed the watch across the counter. She ran back with the money and managed to get 2 young men to help her carry Gabriel to the clinic. She bought the antibiotics, the sterile bandages, and the medicine he desperately needed. Throughout the long, flickering night in the clinic's waiting room, she stayed awake, nursing him with water and wiping the sweat from his brow. She didn't think about her lost watch or her own hunger. She only thought about the man who had fixed her roof when she was ready to die. As the first light of dawn touched the city, a deep, peaceful sleep finally overtook her. If you believe that a sacrifice made in love is never truly lost, please support this story with a like and subscribe to our channel. When Esmeralda woke up 2 hours later, the clinic bed was empty and the sheets were neatly folded. Gabriel was gone. She walked back to her shack in a daze, wondering if it had all been a fever dream. But when she pushed open her door, the house was spotless, and the air smelled of fresh calamansi and clean rain. On her small wooden table, where she usually kept her sampaguita strings, sat a thick blue envelope. It had no name on the outside, but it felt heavy with the weight of a miracle. Her hands shook as she reached for it, her heart sensing that the silence of the room was filled with a presence she could not see, but could deeply feel. Esmeralda sat at her small wooden table, her fingers trembling as she tore open the thick blue envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a stack of official legal documents with the gold seal of a major shipping company. It was a maritime insurance settlement from 20 years ago. Delphin had worked for this company his entire life, and after his death, a forgotten claim for pension arrears and life insurance had finally been processed. The total amount was 1,200,000 pesos. Esmeralda felt the room spin. The money was a fortune, enough to buy a real house and live in peace forever. But as she gripped the papers, She realized the timing was more than just luck. Just as she was processing the shock, a loud, frantic knocking echoed through the plywood door. It was not the gentle knock of Gabriel. When she opened it, she saw her son Paolo and his wife Gina. They looked ragged and broken. Their expensive clothes were stained, and their faces were hollow with desperation. They had lost everything in the failed business scam in Canada they had bragged about. The people they owed money to were hunting them down, and they had nowhere else to hide. They looked at the clean, sturdy walls of Esmeralda's house, and then at her, their eyes filled with a greedy hope. "Mama, please, we have no place to go," Paolo cried, reaching out to touch her arm. "They took our car, our condo, everything. We were wrong, but we are family." Gina stood behind him, weeping silently, her pride finally crushed by the weight of their own greed. Esmeralda looked at her children, the ones who had left her in a jeepney terminal with a broken watch and a handful of pesos. She looked at the new roof Gabriel had built, and the empty spot on her wrist where her husband's watch used to be. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the truth was about to be revealed. She stood tall, no longer the invisible ghost of the slums. "You can stay," she said firmly, her voice steady and clear. "But you will not stay as owners. This house is no longer a place for greed." She told them they would sleep on the floor and work for every meal they ate. They would learn that a roof is only as strong as the love and honesty beneath it. If you believe that true justice begins with a changed heart rather than a harsh punishment, please support this story by liking and subscribing to our channel. The cycle of pain was ending, not with a strike, but with a boundary made of iron and grace. The first night with Paolo and Gina in the shack was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Esmeralda lay on her wooden cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her children tossing and turning on the hard floor. The expensive perfumes they once wore had been replaced by the scent of sweat and the salty air of Tondo. Outside, the rain began to tap gently on the new iron roof Gabriel had installed. It was a rhythmic, peaceful sound, like a heartbeat. Esmeralda reached into her pocket and touched the thick blue envelope. 1,200,000 pesos. It was enough to cast them out and live in luxury, yet she felt no urge to seek revenge. She realized that the greatest power wasn't the money, but the peace she felt in the presence of the truth. The next morning, at exactly 6 o'clock, Esmeralda stood by the door. She did not wake them with shouts, but with the quiet scrape of a broom. "The day starts now," she said softly as they rubbed their tired eyes. Paolo looked at the small bowl of rice and salted fish she placed on the table. It was the same meal he had mocked just a few months ago. He looked at his mother's calloused hands and then at the sturdy roof above them. For the first time in his life, the shame in his heart was greater than his pride. He picked up the broom without being asked. He began to sweep the dirt from the floor, his movements slow and uncertain, while Gina started washing the few plastic plates in a basin of rainwater. As the sun rose higher, Esmeralda walked to the local chapel to offer a prayer of thanks. On her way back, she saw Mrs. Santos standing by her gate, looking frustrated. The wealthy woman's own roof had sprung a massive leak during the night, and the expensive contractors she called were too busy to come. Mrs. Santos looked at Esmeralda's humble but perfectly repaired home with eyes full of disbelief. "How did you do it, old woman?" she barked, though her voice lacked its usual sting. "Who fixed your house while the rest of us suffered?" Esmeralda simply smiled, thinking of the man in the white barong. "A friend who knows that a foundation is built on more than just hollow blocks," she replied. The transformation of the house was becoming a transformation of the family. Paolo and Gina no longer spoke of Canada or big investments. They spoke of the price of charcoal and the best way to patch a leak. They were learning the value of a single peso and the dignity of manual labor. Esmeralda watched them, her heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and hope. She knew the road to true change was long and steep. If you believe that God uses our darkest moments to strip away our illusions and show us what truly matters, please support this story with a like and subscribe to our channel. The real work was just beginning, and the silence of the shack was no longer empty. It was waiting for the next move of a hidden hand. Weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of labor and repentance. Paolo and Gina were no longer the arrogant couple who arrived in Quezon City with empty promises. Their hands were rough from scrubbing floors and carrying water, but their eyes had regained a clarity they hadn't possessed in years. One evening, As a soft orange sunset bathed the rooftops of Tondo, Esmeralda called them to the small wooden table. The air was still, and the distant sound of a neighbor's radio played a slow kundiman. She took the thick blue envelope from its hiding place and laid it between them. The gold seal of the shipping company caught the fading light, looking like a silent witness to their transformation. "This is the insurance settlement from your father's years at sea," Esmeralda said, her voice barely above a whisper. 1,200,000 pesos. It arrived the day Gabriel left. Paulo gasped, his face turning pale as he realized the magnitude of the fortune his mother had been holding in silence. Gina's eyes filled with tears, not of greed, but of a profound realization. They had been living in poverty while their mother held the key to a kingdom, yet she had chosen to teach them how to live before she showed them how to be rich. The silence in the shack was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own shallow breathing. Esmeralda looked at her son, seeing the man he was becoming, the man Delphine would have been proud of. "I could have bought a mansion and left you in the streets, just as you left me at the terminal," she continued. "But a house is not built with hollow blocks or cement. It is built with the truth that comes to light when we have nothing left to hide." She pushed the envelope toward Paulo. "We will use this money to build a real home, but it will be a home with an open door. We will start a small business, a lugawan, to feed those who are as invisible as I was." The weight of her grace was heavier than any punishment. Paulo reached out, not for the money but for his mother's hand. He wept openly, his forehead resting on her calloused palm. "I am sorry, Ma," he choked out. "I didn't see you. I only saw what I could take." In that moment, the unrighteous structures of their past, the lies, the ego, the coldness, crumbled naturally, not through a miracle of fire, but through the quiet power of a mother's forgiveness. If you have ever witnessed a heartbreak, just so the light could finally get in, please support this story with a like and subscribe to our channel. The transformation was public and undeniable. Neighbors who once mocked the Sampaguita widow now watched as the family worked together to renovate the small space into a sanctuary. The truth had set them free, but it was a freedom earned through the price of their pride. Esmeralda knew that Gabriel's work was done, yet she felt his presence in every nail Paulo hammered and every bowl of soup Gina prepared. The God who fixes roofs had done something much deeper. He had repaired the foundation of a family that had been broken by the world's empty promises. Months later, the street corner in Tondo had completely changed its face. The old shack was now a sturdy, clean building with a wide front window. A hand-painted sign hung above it, "Delphine's Grace Lugawan." Every morning at 6 o'clock, the smell of ginger, toasted garlic, and fresh rice porridge filled the humid air. Paulo was no longer in a business suit. He wore a simple apron and served the pedicab drivers with a genuine smile. Gina spent her afternoons teaching the local street children how to read, using old newspapers and a small chalkboard. They were not just recovering their lives, they were restoring their dignity through service. Esmeralda watched them from her chair, her heart full of a quiet, unshakable peace that no bank account could ever provide. One Friday morning, a familiar figure approached the window. It was Mrs. Santos, but she looked different. Her expensive jewelry was gone, and her face was etched with a new kind of humility. She had lost a major lawsuit regarding her properties, and for the first time, she knew what it felt like to be uncertain about the future. She stood before Esmeralda, looking down at her shoes. "I was wrong about your God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He didn't just fix your roof. He rebuilt your whole world while I was busy tearing mine down." Esmeralda didn't gloat. She simply handed Mrs. Santos a warm bowl of lugu and a piece of fresh pan de sal. "Eat," Esmeralda said softly. "The table of the Lord has room for everyone who is hungry for the truth." As the sun reached its peak, Esmeralda walked toward the street lamp where she had first seen the man in the white barong. The flickering light had been replaced by a steady glow, and the alley felt safer, almost sacred. She realized that Gabriel hadn't performed a single magical act. He hadn't brought down fire or struck her enemies. He had simply been there, a physical presence of love that made the darkness retreat. His quiet, decisive actions had forced the truth to come into the light, and that truth had done the heavy lifting of justice. If you believe that God's greatest power is shown in the quiet moments of mercy and patience, please support this story with a like and subscribe to our channel. The Delphin's Grace Lugawan became a sanctuary for the neighborhood. Every Friday, the first 50 bowls were free for the orphans and the elderly. Esmeralda often looked at the empty space on her wrist where her husband's Seiko watch used to be. She didn't miss it anymore. The watch told her the time, but Gabriel had taught her about eternity. She knew now that her God was not a distant judge, but a companion who wades through the flood with his people. He was the one who climbed the roof when no one else would. He was the one who stayed when the world walked away. The roof was fixed, the family was whole, and the heart of Tondo had a new beat. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Manila Bay in shades of violet and gold. Lola Esmeralda sat on her porch, her hands resting peacefully on her lap. Beside her, the blue envelope lay empty, its contents already transformed into bricks, mortar, and hope. Paolo and Gina were inside, laughter bubbling up as they prepared the next day's batch of savory lugao. The heavy air of Tondo, once thick with the scent of stagnant water and despair, now felt light and clear. Esmeralda looked at the small wooden table where Gabriel had once sat. She realized that the greatest miracle was not the iron roof or the insurance money. It was the quiet restoration of a mother's heart and the return of a lost son. Gabriel never returned in the physical form, but his presence was etched into every corner of their new life. He didn't need to perform a spectacular wonder to prove his power. He simply walked among them, fixed what was broken, and stood as a shield when the storm was at its worst. His non-violent strength had caused the walls of greed to crumble naturally, leaving room for a foundation of truth. Esmeralda knew that the world would still have storms, and roofs might leak again, but she was no longer afraid. She had seen that the creator of the stars is not too busy to climb a ladder and help an old woman in the dark. The story of the widow with the iron roof spread through the barangay, a living testimony that justice is not found in revenge, but in the steady courage to do what is right. Esmeralda's life was a reminder that even when you are discarded by the world, you are never invisible to the one who wears a simple white shirt and walks the dusty streets. She found her husband's watch in the local pawn shop months later, bought it back and placed it on the shelf, not to tell the time, but to remember the hour she chose to save a stranger. Every tick of the clock was now a heartbeat of gratitude in a house built on grace. If this story reminded you that God sees your every struggle and acts in His perfect time, please support it with a like. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of faith and transformation that find light in the darkest places. We would love to hear from you. Write the word Amen in the comments if you believe that a humble heart can move mountains through the power of silent prayer. May you always find the strength to be a foundation of love for those around you, knowing that you are never walking alone in the rain.